So Francis set as my charge to do a high-level introduction to the science of memory, and I'm going to try to do that. I've got 20 minutes, 60 slides, and new braces that might get in the way of a baud rate necessary to do 20 minutes, 60 slides, but we'll see how we do, okay? The hope here is to hit on some major concepts in the science of memory, highlight some of the emerging neuroscience in these areas, with the hope that it'll both set the stage for some of the work that Ian's going to talk about, as well as to set the stage for some of our discussion. In order to get going, why don't we do a little memory demo, memory test. Some of you may have come across this in the past. If so, it'll probably work on you anyway, so we're going to proceed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a list of items to remember for later in the talk. Don't write anything down, just try to encode these items, and we'll come back to them at another point. All right, here we go. All right, great. So we'll come back to this. Let's move forward. My goal here is, again, to introduce the science of memory. And in thinking about the science of memory, you know, over the years, our conceptualization of memory has changed, has evolved rather dramatically. For quite a long time, we, as a field, had parcellated memory at least into two classes of memories. The notion of sort of short-term memory, or in the field, sort of the current jargon is working memory. The idea that we have systems, mechanisms in place that allow us to interact with the world at a given point in time, build some internal representation of something out there in the world, and to hang on to that information for a very brief period of time. Keep it active in mind, perhaps at the focus of attention, such that we can operate on that information over small sort of time gaps, time lags between when we encounter the information and when we need it. This form of sort of this transient form of memory is long been viewed as one class of memory, and then we've had this notion that, well, we've got this long-term form of memory. The system is plastic. This plasticity gives rise to durable changes that result in structural changes in the system, such that what we encoded at time one can be reinstated, brought back to mind at some point in the future. Could be minutes, hours, days, weeks, years later, can be brought back to mind given the right cues, such that we can use that information. And for a long time, the field was focused on this, you know, trying to understand the differences between working memory and long-term memory. But about 35, 40 years ago, the field, first with the observation of patients with focal brain lesions to particular structures in the inner wall of the temporal lobes, and then subsequently careful not only human patient work, but animal lesion and recording work, and subsequently brain imaging work. We now know that, in fact, there's not a single form of long-term memory. There are multiple forms of long-term memory. That, in essence, our brains, they're structured to be plastic in all ways, in all systems. Our brains have as its agenda, not to anthropomorphize, but to essentially build internal models of the world, to update those models based on experience, such that at some point in the future, we can draw on this updated model, this knowledge about the way the world was, in terms of either actions, rewards, the co-occurrence of event elements. We can draw on that knowledge to inform what we might be thinking and doing in the present. And we now understand memory and long-term memory as actually not a single thing, but multiple things. There are forms of long-term memory that, jargony terms, we kind of think of as declarative or explicit. These are forms of knowledge that we've acquired, that are stable in mind, that we can consciously access, we're consciously aware of. We know often when we're using memory. You know that you're drawing on memory when I ask you, what was the discussion that you had last night at dinner? You know you're making reference back to your episodic traces, your episodic memories of that particular event. But there are other forms of long-term memory that we're often, that are there. They're there all the time. It actually makes contact with the work that BJ and Buffy were talking about in terms of habits, rewards, as well as skills. There are conditioned responses. There's phenomena known as priming. There are these other forms of long-term memory that are operating at all times for us. often, if not almost always, outside of our awareness, that are shaping what we're currently seeing, how we're seeing, how we're affectively responding, what approach decisions we may be expressing, etc. And much of our behavior is the byproduct of these sort of non-conscious, implicit, non-declarative forms of memory. I'm not going to talk about any of that. What I am going to do is focus in on, given the centrality of episodic memory, I'm going to focus my comments in on just some of the science of episodic memory and just make some high-level points, okay? So when we talk about episodic memory, we're talking about conscious memory for life's events. We're having this, your brain, you are having this sort of experience at this moment in time, consists of an ensemble of features. You're seeing my face, the images on the slide, the words that I'm expressing and their meaning. You're in a spatial context in which this is all occurring. And your brain is sort of representing these disparate features of this particular moment in its history. And it's building representations of the co-occurrence of those features. And it's the building of these sort of representations of feature co-occurrence. One shot, because we have episodes are one-shot experiences for us as organisms. It's the building of these representations that allow us at some point in the future to encounter cues and bring back to mind the details of this event. And what I'm going to do in the 15 minutes that I have is just briefly talk about the life cycle of long-term memories, the life cycle of episodic memories, focusing in on factors that are influence probability of encoding, factors that drive retrieval as well. In the course of that, we'll talk a little bit about what are some of the mechanisms that lead to forgetting, as well as false memory. Onward. So thinking about the life cycle of the memory, you're having this experience. Encoding mechanisms in your brain are beginning to build representations, binding these features together into a coherent representation. This is sort of the encoding stage. Things will happen post this moment when you leave the room through which these traces begin to consolidate, transform, get stabilized, both in the short term. There's also a longer term form of consolidation. I won't say much about consolidation. And then at some point in the future, you may get a cue back to this particular event and try to retrieve some aspect of it. And so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about factors in encoding and factors of retrieval, and hopefully you'll see some of the legal relevance. Okay. A simple cartoon model of some of the neural mechanisms that are important for building episodic memories. This structure here on the inner wall of the medial temporal lobe, the hippocampus, and the cortical regions that surround it and project into it, we know that this circuit is fundamentally critical for building and being able to retrieve episodic memories. This is the first site typically affected in patients who suffer from mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. And if you have damage to the structure, you will have a dense interrograde amnesia, the inability to acquire new episodes, episodic representations. During some event, we have this sort of multi-featural representation of that event in disparate parts of the brain and cortical and subcortical structures. Ultimately, the outputs of these areas project through the medial temporal cortex onto the hippocampus, and it's the fact that the hippocampus is a convergence zone for the outputs of all these different cortical and subcortical regions, and the unique architecture of the hippocampus that allows neurons in the hippocampus, when they have this driving influence from different parts of the brain representing different aspects of the event, when you have this concurrent driving input, those neurons can wire together. And it's in fact thought that it's this sort of conjunctive or associative representation that is the heart. It's sort of the index back to this set of features that were present out in cortex. You lose these representations, you lose episodic memory. Okay. So what influences or affects what gets into those representations and the probability that the representations, in fact, will be built in the first place? And you as judges undoubtedly know, attention is a fundamental, and you as sort of humans know, attention is fundamental to effective encoding and retrieval. We've experienced this at least I experience this on a day-to-day basis in rather trivial ways. You know, you come home, you place your house keys down, you're not really attending where you put them down, and you need to head out at some point in the future, and you're like, where the heck did I put the car keys? I have no idea. It's not, I keep telling myself that I'm getting older, and this is memory change. It's that I'm busier and I'm not attending. Now that's sort of an everyday, sort of trivial example. Imagine that you're about to rush off to work one morning, and you've got a big meeting, you're thinking about that meeting, your wife or your husband says, oh, hey, honey, I can't take your new sort of 1-year-old child to daycare. Can you quickly swing by daycare and drop her off? You sure grab the kid, put the kid in the car, your attention is distracted, you get out of your car, you go into your office, you come out of your car at the end of the day, and your child has been sitting in 100-some-odd-degree weather in the car and is dead. And this happens apparently a good number of times each year here in the States alone. Distraction, inattention, both at the time of learning and at the time of retrieval. We know a lot, for time reasons I won't really go into this, we know a lot about the neural mechanisms of attention, about how attention facilitates or amplifies the neural representation of information that we are attending to. We know that attention isn't a single thing in and of itself. It's dependent upon at least 2 neural circuits in the brain, a dorsal network in the frontal and parietal lobes that allow us to attend to things that are goal relevant, essentially sort of seemingly strategically allocate attention to things that matter to us in terms of trying to accomplish our goals at one moment in time. And then a second network that depends on different structures, different set of regions in the frontal and parietal lobes that seem to detect relevant things out there in the world, highly salient or novel things out there in the environment, and that in essence put a brake on this sort of top-down goal-directed allocation of attention. It puts a brake on it and allows us to rapidly shift attention to this unexpected salient information. And so we've got these 2 forms of attention, and in the last sort of decade or so, functional brain imaging studies of memory have in fact demonstrated that if you're scanning somebody as they're encountering a set of experiences, so they're in the scanner, they're encountering a bunch of items, they're presumably building memories of those items because these are episodes in the individual's life. You take this subject out of the scanner and you probe their memory for the things that were encountered in the scanner. And you ask what was going on in the brain during those experiences in the scanner that the person could later remember versus those experiences that the person later forgot. And one thing that that imaging studies have shown is that, in fact, engagement of this sort of top-down attention network is positively predictive of later memory, consistent again with this idea that the strategic goal-directed allocation of attention to stimuli increases the probability we will build memories of those stimuli such that we can later remember. By contrast, regions, this sort of reflexive attention network, the degree to which it is engaged during stimulus encoding, studies indicate is negatively predictive of subsequent memory, consistent with an interpretation that to the extent that as we're encountering an event, an experience, to the degree that our attention is captured by other things, other salient aspects of the event, that may not be what we care about, say, for the legal system in terms of trying to probe the witness's memory for some event. To the degree that attention has been captured by other things, that has a negative consequence for encoding the information that we might care about at some point in the future. Here's another point about attention, made quite nicely by Scooter Libby's lawyer. I particularly like an aspect of the wording the lawyer used. So this is in relation to Libby being charged with perjury in the Valerie claim incident. Libby's lawyer said, well, Libby, it's not that he perjured himself. One, his attention was divided. He was encoding these sort of events amidst the sort of hectic rush of issues and events at a busy time for our government. Okay, great. And here's the quote, the start of this quote I particularly like. And then lawyer goes on to, or his attorney goes on to say, as lawyers, not as humans, but as lawyers, we recognize that our clients may sometimes report memories that differ from the reports of other folks. I like the as lawyers, it implies something, but we recognize that a person's recollection and memory of events will not always match those of other people. Now, I'm not judging this case in any way, other than to make this point or pivot from this last point that we know this as you can have a shared experience with your partner, with your husband, your wife, and walk away from that shared event with completely different memories of what happened. And then you can spend decades of your lives together debating that. And this is a byproduct of the role of attention in filtering, in shaping, in determining what aspects of an event. Encoding the building of memories is this incidental byproduct of attending to an experience as it's ongoing. We can attend to different aspects of an experience, and those aspects that we attend to, whether they're perceptual attributes of the event, maybe we verbally label the event that we're encountering, we think about its meaning in relation to other things. What we attend to influences what ultimately is built and laid down in episodic memory. Okay, last point about encoding. Retrieval is, in fact, one of the ways in which we encode new memories and alter our memories. Let me just tell you quickly about a study that gets this point across, and then I'll try to bridge out into the legal relevance in a moment. So here's a very simple study. You come into the lab, you're given a text passage, and you're in one of three conditions. You have this text passage, and you have the opportunity to read the text passage, read it again, read it again, read it again. So you have 4 opportunities to study this material, to encode it. Or you might have 3 opportunities to study the text passage, and then your last experience is to freely recall as much as you can before you get to the final test. Or you might only have 1 chance to actually encode the material. And then all your other opportunities are just retrieving whatever you encoded from memory over and over and over again for the next 3 times. You ask people at the end of, in group 1, group 2, group 3, how well do you think you know this material? How well do you think you've learned this information? And then you probe people's memory. You ask them 5 minutes or 1 week later, tell me everything you can from this text passage. Subjects who had 4 opportunities to study the material say, I think I learned quite a lot. Folks who had 1 opportunity to study the material and then just engaged in retrieval practice said, I didn't learn as much. Here's performance on the immediate test, here's performance on the delayed test. There's a small but significant advantage for having studied the material multiple times when your memory is tested immediately after the last study episode. By contrast, however, those who studied, they lose a significant percentage of what they were able to hold on to in the very short term. Those subjects who had only 1 chance to study, but then engaged in retrieval over and over again, they retained the vast majority of the information they encoded. Retrieval, retrieval is a remarkably powerful experience for our memories. It results in not only the strengthening of representations that have been encoded, but also the laying down of new representations, the altering of those representations. And in fact, we know this, retrieval, so we know retrieval causes learning. It can promote long-term retention, but each of those acts of retrieval by a witness, not only strengthens the information that they're repeatedly retrieving, but it also alters their memory for the event. It increases the probability that what they're retrieving will be able to be retained over the long term, and it decreases the probability that the information they haven't retrieved will be lost, will be decreasingly accessible, and because each of these acts of retrieval is reconstructive. Each act of retrieval could itself be introducing small little errors into memory that themselves then are held on to for a long duration of time. Okay, I think I can finish this in the last 5 to 7 minutes that I have. Okay, let's move a little bit more on to retrieval. So retrieval from episodic memory is cue dependent. We know this. The reactivation of these memories critically rests on what cues we have available at that point in the future that are being used to sort of jog the memory from mind. And we now know that at least a key part of episodic remembering is kind of this mental time travel for the brain back to a state in which it was in at the time that the experience was encountered. A retrieval cue comes in. Ultimately, it may make contact with this stored hippocampal pointer, hippocampal representation of the event, and the hippocampus is able to reinstate both within itself off of partial cues, but then project or reinstate back to cortex these patterns of activation, these patterns of feature representation that were present during the event. This is the way in which seeing a face and representing that face in your cortex at that time of retrieval can, in essence, cue the reinstatement of the discussion we were having last night, the content of the discussion, where we were, can reinstate these other features of the event that aren't present right there for you as an organism in your sensory world. The only way they come into your awareness is through this mental time travel of your cortex and subcortical structures back to the state in which they were in when the event occurred. And we know a lot about how retrieval, in fact, partially depends upon this sort of reinstatement of information out in the cortex. Here are patterns of activation when people are encoding, when subjects are encoding information about people versus scenes. And you can see different cortical areas are more active during person encoding versus scene encoding. And now when you cue people to remember scenes or people, you see a reinstatement of activation in those same structures. And in fact, now using distributed pattern analyses along the lines that Jeff Aguirre made reference to very briefly yesterday in his talk, we can quantify the similarity of the brain state at retrieval to the similarity of the brain at the time of encoding. And in fact, the stronger the similarity, the higher the probability that the person will be correct in the memory expression in their memory at that time of retrieval. So there's a relationship between this sort of reinstatement of these brain patterns and subjects' ability to remember details of an event. Let's skip over that. All right, so retrieval is cue dependent. Ian's going to talk a bit about this when it comes to recognition memory. Because retrieval is cue dependent, and any given memory probe is only a partial assay of what, thank you, it's only a partial assay of what's in the system, okay? So you can, and what comes out, a readout of what a person remembers of an event critically rests on how we're probing their memory. So here's a classic study by Harry Barrick and colleagues where they asked folks to try to free recall all the names of their classmates from high school. And then after they did that, they presented them all the names plus a bunch of FOIL names, and they looked at how well subject retained this information over 50 years. When they're given free recall, you can see that through time, the probability of being able to bring back to mind your classmates' names is significantly declining. Here, when you give them a recognition probe, you present them that information, you can see that the rate of decline is remarkably less. Again, illustrating your conclusion about what a witness or what a person may know will critically depend upon how you're probing their memory and what cues are available. That's recognition versus recall. You can also, or free recall, you also can give them sort of helpful cues. Okay, tell me the members of the football team, et cetera. And when you do free cube recall, you give them additional cues. Performance, again, is improving. So we know that memory is cue dependent, and therefore part of forgetting is, in fact, having the wrong cues, not having the optimal set of cues at the time of retrieval attempt. Okay. 2 minutes there. I see your signs. All right, why do we forget? Part of the reason we're forgetting is we don't have the right cues. It's not because our brains fill up. This is, so we have insufficient cues, interference, the misinformation effect of Loftus and colleagues. She talked about it as memory overriding. It's not really memory overriding. It's our memory for something in the past changes, and our ability to get back to it changes, declines, due to new learning. Memory retrieval is inherently competitive. We build new memories that interfere with our ability to get back to old memories. This now dovetailed with the point that retrieval is an encoding event, means that as we retrieve, if when we're retrieving, we're introducing errors into our memories, those new memories that we're building during the act of retrieval that are distorted and that contain misinformation can block access to, can interfere with our ability to get back to the memory for the event itself. And there's a related point that this active retrieval can also actually weaken the actual initially encoded representation as well. I won't spend any time on that. Okay, last point. Promise, Sarah. All right. Other forms, other causes of false memory. We know that this active retrieval, we know that a lot of our memory decisions are the similarity of a retrieval cue to what's stored in memory matters. It heavily influences the strength of the memory signal that is triggered by the cue, as well as what other things might come to mind. In the Oklahoma City bombing, after the bombing, there was a sketch of McVeigh, and there was a sketch of a second John Doe number 2. John Doe number 1 ended up being Timothy McVeigh. John Doe number 2 ended up being a gentleman named Todd Bunting, who had the unfortunate, though in the end this ended well for him, the unfortunate fact that he resembled a guy that McVeigh. Let me step this back. McVeigh resembled a buddy of Todd Bunting's. When McVeigh was identified, people said, I saw that guy, and he had a colleague, he had a friend who went into this mechanic shop where McVeigh got the Ryder truck, went into this shop. There's a second person, this John Doe number 2. So the similarity of Bunting's friend to Timothy McVeigh in his appearance sent the nation on this manhunt for Bunting as a possible accomplice to the crime. This makes the point that we're always, much of our acts of retrieval are in fact computing the similarity of what's out there in the world right now to our representations, and we often make false memory decisions. This is why I often am waving to people who actually don't know me at all, because I've got this. Maybe, hey, how are you doing? They're similar to somebody I must have encountered. All right, this is basically the end stage here. If you recognize the word that each of the words that I'm going to show you, humor me, clap or stomp your foot, and the DBs will tell us the percentage of the room that's remembering the item. So here we go.
No. Yes.
No.
All right, somebody said no, somebody knows the demo. All right, so really quickly, because we're out of time, here's the test list. Everybody said, a good recognition of candy, heart, tooth, pie, and a lot of people said sweet. Of course, the trick is that sweet isn't on the list, but it's semantically similar to the events that you would encounter. You can warn people about this. You can tell folks there are going to be items that are similar. There will be a high probability of false alarm to these similar events. This is the person who looks a lot like the suspect, who's in the lineup, who you're tempted to say was, in fact, the individual. There are other causes of false memory. I really am wrapping up. Not just similarity-based false memories. Clinton, I think, got into trouble during the campaign against Obama because he had this distinct memory of landing in Bosnia under gunfire, and she had to run off the tarmac, and it wasn't helpful when there was the video of her hugging the girl, receiving flowers, and dancing on the tarmac. Turns out, I've struggled to track this down, but I remember as it was occurring at the time, one of the main senators, it might have been Collins, actually landed in Bosnia under gunfire. And my speculation is Clinton and Collins sort of discussed this. There's partial overlap in their events, and in the end, Clinton misattributed her thinking about Collins' experience as her own. And we, in fact, know from the lab that, in fact, we can mistake imagination for reality. We can mistake our thinking about possible experiences as actually experiences that we've encountered, and in fact we can read out and we can quantify the degree to which the cortical representations, the brain representations of imagined experiences, the degree to which they resemble those of true experiences is predictive of the probability that we will claim that what we imagine is actually something we've experienced. All right, I am going to end it there, other than to make reference, which might contact with what Owen is going to talk about and what Jeff alluded to. As part of the research network, they've offered generous support to my lab to try to see whether we can leverage functional brain imaging and new analysis techniques to look at the brain patterns of an individual at a given point in time and be able to read out or say something about their memory. Are they recognizing the image, the person that they're seeing at that moment in time? Are they failing to recognize it? What's the richness of their memory, et cetera? And we've also, with Martha Farah and Liz Phelps, we had a paper recently, just came out in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, where we've evaluated the scientific literature on fMRI-based lie detection, and it was actually fMRI-based lie detection that I weighed in on in that case in Maryland, and I'd be happy to talk about that as well. Sorry for going a few minutes long, Sarah, but not bad for braces. Okay, I'm done.